responsible for Shakur's death. Instead, Davis says he's being railroaded by authorities.
For decades, the question of who killed Tupac Shakur has haunted hip-hop like a ghost that refuses to fade. But while the world obsessed over the gunman in that black BMW, one man quietly carried his own truth: Snoop Dogg. Behind the fame, behind the smoke and laid-back charm, Snoop had been holding on to years of anger, fear, and betrayal. All pointed toward one person: Suge Knight, the ruthless head of Death Row Records. What started as brotherhood between two street-bred icons turned into paranoia, near death, and a reckoning that forced Snoop to face the darkest chapter of his past. This is the untold story of Snoop Dogg's long road from loyalty to survival, and the night he finally confronted the man he believed had Tupac's blood on his hands. Death Row's Kingdom: The Rise of Fear and Power. Death Row Records wasn't built in an office. It was built out of hustle, ambition, and a vision that mixed business with the streets. It was less a traditional record label and more a movement with its own rules, loyalty, and hierarchy. And at the top sat one man, Marion Suge Knight. To some, he was a savior, the executive who gave voice to artists the industry had overlooked. To others, he was a force you didn't challenge: confidence, power, and intensity wrapped in the same presence. Suge carried himself like a general. 6'4", 260 pounds, broad-shouldered, commanding. When he walked into a room, people noticed. He could be persuasive, generous, and fiercely loyal to those who showed him the same. But that loyalty came with weight. Suge believed in discipline, structure, and respect, values that made Death Row run like a machine, but also blurred the line between business and control. Under Suge's leadership, Death Row felt untouchable. With Dr. Dre's The Chronic and Snoop's Doggy Style, the label rewrote hip-hop. Then came Tupac's All Eyes on Me, and Death Row was no longer just a label. It became a cultural empire. The studio looked like a palace. Marble floors, champagne on tap, endless cars lined up outside. But behind that luxury, there was pressure. Everyone knew the rule. Loyalty wasn't optional. It was expected. Suge offered protection and opportunity, but they came with accountability. For some artists, that balance felt empowering. For others, it became suffocating. Snoop, still grateful for Suge's early backing, started noticing the cost. The brotherhood vibe that once felt like family started to tighten around him. Privacy faded, and freedom came with conditions. The higher the label climbed, the heavier the air became. And yet, Death Row's empire kept rising, one hit after another. But with every success came paranoia, and with every new artist, Suge's control tightened. The power, the money, the fame. It looked like a dream from the outside. But for those living it, it was starting to feel like a trap dressed in platinum. But the bigger the empire grew, the smaller the space for independence became. And that's when Tupac walked in. Tupac's transformation: fame, fury, and the gangsta mirage. When Tupac joined Death Row, it was painted like a fairy tale. The streets saw Suge Knight as a hero, the man who freed Pac from jail when nobody else could. $1 million bail check, a private jet, and a Death Row contract waiting on the table. To the public, Suge had saved hip-hop's fallen prince. But behind that handshake was a silent transaction, one that would change both men forever. Pac came out of prison like a man possessed. His old self, the poetic revolutionary, was still there, but he'd wrapped it in armor now. Death Row gave him freedom, but also a uniform. The cars, the jewelry, the red suits, all part of a new identity. And Suge? He knew exactly what he was doing. He turned Tupac into the perfect weapon. Charismatic, unpredictable, untouchable. Snoop watched the change like watching lightning strike too close. Pac's lyrics got sharper, angrier. His circle got smaller. The laughter they once shared turned into tension, and the warmth into warning signs. Suge had a way of giving everyone what they wanted. Dre wanted control, Snoop wanted recognition, Pac wanted power, and each got it, but at a price. Tupac was no longer just making music. He was leading an army. and every diss, every interview, and every camera flash added gasoline to the fire. He'd gone from activist to assassin, still brilliant, still magnetic, but now consumed by a need to prove himself. Snoop tried to keep the peace, but Death Row wasn't built for it anymore. Pac had become the face of Death Row's war, and Snoop could feel the lines hardening. What had once been about beats and bars was now about loyalty and blood. And as their fame grew, so did its complexity. Fame, money, and influence drew people in, but they also drew tension. By the time Tupac arrived, Death Row had reached its peak. What started as a dream of independence had become something much bigger and far more difficult to control. East versus West, when music became warfare. The shot that started the East-West war didn't come from a diss track. It came from a hallway in New York City. Tupac was ambushed at Quad Studios in 1994, shot 5 times, and left bleeding. When he woke up, he wasn't just wounded. He was convinced he'd been betrayed. In his mind, Biggie, Puff, and Bad Boy Records weren't friends anymore. They were suspects. That's where everything twisted. What should have been a recovery turned into retaliation. Pac's paranoia became prophecy, and the media ran wild with it. Vibe magazine splashed East versus West across its cover, and just like that, it wasn't two artists beefing. It was two coasts at war. For people who didn't know better, it looked like entertainment. But for those living it, it was life and death. Every diss track became ammunition. Every performance was a statement. And while Suge Knight fanned the flames, Snoop tried to cool them down. But by then it was too late. The momentum was too strong, the ego too loud. When Tupac dropped Hit 'Em Up, it was like an earthquake. The disrespect was nuclear, calling out Biggie by name, mocking his marriage, and daring anyone to respond. Snoop heard it and told Pac, "Cuz, that ain't it." But Pac wasn't listening. His pride had taken the wheel, and Suge was in the passenger seat cheering him on. The West Coast was now the front line. The media painted Pac and Suge as villains, while fans on both sides picked colors like it was gang territory. The industry didn't just document the beef, it monetized it. Snoop found himself stuck between two worlds, loyalty to Pac and the instinct to survive. And as he watched cameras turn rap into warfare, one thing became clear. The lines between entertainment and real life had completely disappeared. The war wasn't in the studio anymore, it was in the streets. The Vegas shooting, 4 shots, and the yellow tape. September 7th, 1996. It was a night meant for celebration, but it turned out to be one that would carve its name into hip-hop's history with blood and heartbreak. Tupac Shakur and Suge Knight had descended upon Las Vegas like kings after the Mike Tyson fight at the MGM Grand. Tupac was on top of the world, defiant and magnetic as ever, his confidence glowing brighter than the neon that painted the strip. But underneath that glow, something darker hummed, a tension that crackled quietly between the flashing lights, like a storm waiting for a cue. After the fight, a scuffle broke out in the MGM lobby, quick, chaotic, but charged enough to shift the night's mood. Security broke it up, but the energy had changed. Tupac, with adrenaline still pumping, jumped into Suga's black BMW, and the two sped off down the Vegas Strip. Music thumped, lights blurred, and for a brief second, it felt like they were untouchable. Two men riding through the heart of Sin City, invincible under the desert night sky. But then came the red light at Flamingo and Koval. A white Cadillac crept up beside them, and what happened next was over in seconds. The pop-pop-pop of gunfire tearing through glass and steel, the kind of sound that splits time itself. Tupac was hit 4 times. Suge caught shrapnel in his head, but, almost superhumanly, kept driving until the car crashed to a stop under that glowing traffic light. Sirens began to rise in the distance, and in that moment, one of hip-hop's brightest stars began to fade. Back in Los Angeles, Snoop Dogg woke to the kind of silence that only bad news carries.
Responsible for Shakur's death. Instead, Davis says he's being railroaded by authorities.
The TV flickered with breaking headlines. Tupac Shakur shot in Las Vegas. Without a second thought, He grabbed his keys and hit the road, driving through the desert toward Nevada with the kind of urgency that makes hours blur together. When he arrived, the hospital smelled like antiseptic and fear. Suge was already there, his head wrapped in bandages, recounting the events of that night. He described pulling Tupac down as bullets shattered the glass, his words steady but distant, like someone still processing the chaos.
I'm driving, telling him I'm going to get to the hospital, kick back. Pac looked at me and said, "You know what? You need the doctor more than me. You the one shot in your head."
There was no anger, no visible grief, just exhaustion, and a silence that said more than any explanation could. When Snoop finally saw Tupac, the reality hit like a punch. Tubes snaked around his body. Machines beeped rhythmically. The man who once moved like fire now lay still as stone. Snoop spoke to him, begged him to wake up, to fight, to pull one of those miraculous comebacks he was known for. But Pac wasn't moving. He never blinked and never answered. When the news finally broke that Tupac Shakur had died, something inside Snoop went silent. Death Row, once a family built on loyalty and ambition, now felt hollow, like the soul had been taken out of it. The energy that once fueled their rise was gone, replaced by uncertainty, grief, and questions no one could answer. For Snoop, it was the moment he realized the world they'd built together would never be the same. But the night didn't just take Tupac. It took the last ounce of trust Snoop had left and replaced it with quiet disbelief. The kind that changes how you see everyone around you, including the ones who were supposed to protect you. The cost of leaving Death Row. Walking away from Death Row wasn't like switching record labels. It was, as Snoop later described it, like trying to get out of a situation where you didn't know if you'd make it out alive. Once you were pulled into Suge Knight's orbit, getting out was difficult. Loyalty ran deep, and so did expectation. According to several people close to the label at the time, leaving Death Row could feel complicated, especially for artists who'd built their careers there. Industry insiders described it as tight-knit but intense, a place where success came with scrutiny. The rumors around that period painted a tense picture. Some associates claimed unmarked cars parked too long outside, and anonymous messages reminded Snoop to stay loyal. Whether those stories were exaggerations or rooted in truth, they reflected the fear many felt in Death Row's final years, a sense that the empire that once promised protection was starting to turn inward. By the late 90s, the writing was on the wall. The glory days were gone. Death Row was unraveling. Suge was running the show from behind bars, and the family spirit had been replaced by fear and silence. Snoop had had enough. Then came Master P, cool-headed, calculated, and a world away from Suge's brand of chaos. He offered Snoop a deal with No Limit Records, a new start in New Orleans. For Snoop, it wasn't about money. As he put it later, it was about breathing again. But to Suge, loyalty was sacred. You didn't leave Death Row, you defected from it. His message to Snoop came loud and cold. You ride with us, or you ride against us. There was no middle ground. Suddenly, familiar faces started to vanish. Old friends stopped picking up the phone. Whispers of betrayal spread like wildfire. Snoop had turned his back, they said. He'd abandoned the cause. And in Suga's world, leaving Death Row wasn't just a career move, but a personal statement. Still, Snoop pressed forward. Every night, Snoop felt it, the eyes watching, the unease in his chest every time a car slowed outside his house. He wasn't paranoid, he was realistic. That's how deep his fear reached. But through it all, Master P kept his word. He put a circle of protection around Snoop, teaching him that peace wasn't weakness, it was power. Under No Limit, Snoop rediscovered something he'd almost forgotten. Joy. Making music without fear. Smiling without watching his back. But even as he rebuilt, Death Row's shadow followed him. It wasn't just a label, it was a scar, one that kept reminding him of the price of survival. He had finally walked away from the empire, but the ghosts he left behind were still whispering his name. Because leaving didn't erase the past, it only changed its shape. For a while, it seemed like distance might save him. New city, new label, new life. But some ghosts don't care about geography. They travel through rumors, grudges, and unfinished business. No matter how far Snoop moved from death row, its reach found ways to follow. And when the past finally caught up to him, it didn't knock. It kicked the door in. The breaking point: raids, riots, and running for his life. Freedom looked good on paper, but in reality, it was chaos with better lighting. Even after Snoop left death row, its residue clung to him like smoke. Every city, every show, every crowd carried the risk of running into old enemies who hadn't forgiven him for leaving the label. One night, that risk became real. The venue was packed, the lights blinding, the bass shaking the floor, and then, without warning, the mood shifted. Death row affiliates had shown up deep, not for music, but for confrontation. They weren't there to clap. They were there to send a message. The tension burst into violence: fists, bottles, chairs, bodies crashing. The air filled with the chaos of unfinished business. Just when it seemed like things were about to spiral into something irreversible, Master P's No Limit crew stormed in. Not as aggressors, but as protectors. They got Snoop out of there fast, through a back exit, into a car, and speeding into the night with sirens screaming behind them. For a few miles, Snoop didn't say a word. In the car's silence, Snoop realized that even freedom had a price. He was still being hunted. But trouble didn't stop there. Raids, investigations, search warrants, as if his past sins were tattooed on his record forever. One night, his home was surrounded. Helicopters circled above, red and blue lights cutting through the dark. Officers stormed in, shouting commands, guns raised. Inside, his wife and children cried, terrified. That was the night everything broke. Not his body, but his spirit. Watching rifles aimed at his kids shattered something in him that no bullet ever could. He later said that was the moment he gave up every gun he owned, not because he feared prison, but because he refused to let the violence define his family's story. In that quiet aftermath, he understood the truth he'd been running from. The real enemy wasn't just death row's influence or the streets or the system. It was the idea that survival meant living in fear, and the only way to win was to step out of the cycle completely. He'd faced police, killers, and betrayal, but the scariest part was still ahead. Face to face. Snoop Dogg finally confronts Suge. It was poetic in a cruel kind of way. The same city that took Tupac was about to stage Snoop's reckoning with Suge Knight. Las Vegas, a place built on illusion, luck, and danger. Every corner of it still whispered Tupac's name. Every neon light still flickered like a warning. For Snoop, this wasn't just another city stop. It was the end of something, or maybe the beginning of closure. After Suge Knight's release from prison in 2001, both men had gone their separate ways. Snoop rebuilding his career, and Suge trying to revive what was left of death row. But the history between them ran too deep to disappear. Word spread quickly that Suge was in town. Most people would have taken that as their cue to leave. But Snoop wasn't running anymore. He was done carrying fear like a shadow. He allegedly told his associates, "I'm exposing him now," and sent a message to Suge, asking him to come to his hotel without any guards or entourage. It was a gamble, one with no guarantees. According to close sources, this is how it allegedly went down. When Suge walked in, the atmosphere thickened instantly. No shouting, no guns, and no chaos. Just two men with too much history and too many ghosts between them. Suge smiled, calm and confident, like a man used to being feared. His composure wasn't arrogance, it was power disguised as peace. Snoop started slow, carrying years of hurt that had never found release. He asked the questions that everyone else had buried under loyalty. Why did things turn out this way? Why had the family fallen apart? Why did Tupac have to die? Why did he have to live looking over his shoulder? Each word was both a challenge and a plea, cutting through the silence. Suge didn't even flinch. He never confessed or apologized. He rationalized. Every violent story became a lesson in control. Every betrayal became business. He talked about control like it was a management tactic. There was something haunting about how he could describe the label's leverage and influence with pride, as though the chaos that followed wasn't tragedy to him. It just was part of it. That's when it clicked for Snoop. There would be no confession and no forgiveness. Suge craved dominance. And the only thing that scared a man like that was losing the ability to control someone. So Snoop made the most unexpected move possible. He let go. He told Suge calmly, "I ain't gonna do nothing to you." Not out of weakness, but out of power. It was his rebellion, peace in the face of intimidation. When Suge left that room, there was no closure or handshakes, just silence. But for Snoop, that silence was everything. He had finally faced the man who'd haunted his career and tested his soul. And this time, he walked away standing tall. He left that room alive, but what he learned inside would haunt him for years to come. The Disturbing Revelation by Snoop. The disturbing part of that night wasn't some whispered confession or sudden truth about who pulled the trigger on Tupac. It was far more unsettling than that. It was the realization that Suge Knight didn't need to pull the trigger personally. He just had to make the world feel like he could. Snoop walked away from that meeting understanding something he'd never truly seen before. Suge's power wasn't built on violence, it was built on normalization of it. He had turned fear into currency, chaos into structure, and loyalty into leverage. He didn't need to pull the strings himself. He had convinced everyone the puppet show couldn't run without him. That was his genius, and his curse. It hit Snoop that the death row empire hadn't fallen because of one bad act or one bullet. It was doomed from the moment fear replaced respect. Tupac's death wasn't a conspiracy. It was the inevitable byproduct of a system that fed on ego and blood. The machine they'd all helped build had been running perfectly. It just happened to run on destruction. Looking back, Snoop could see how easily they had all been complicit. Every flashy car, every platinum record, and every wild night at the studio had been bought with silence. Everyone saw the warning signs, the intimidation, the manipulation, the madness, and yet no one stopped it. Because in that world, fear didn't just control people, it also blinded them to the truth. That realization haunted him far more than the violence ever did. The fact that they'd all kept the engine running even as it burned through lives. The fact that it took death, Pac's death, for anyone to realize the cost of their relentless ambition. From that point on, Snoop changed his music, his message, and his entire life. He stopped glorifying survival at any cost and started preaching peace. Because once you see how the game really works, you understand. The only way to win is to stop playing. And from that clarity, a new chapter began. Not built on fear, but on freedom. Rewriting the legacy. Years later, when the smoke cleared and the wars faded into history, Snoop Dogg stood not as the gangsta the media once painted, but as a man who had lived enough to understand peace wasn't weakness. It was wisdom to live another day. He had seen how easy it was to lose yourself chasing power, and how hard it was to find yourself again once the world stopped cheering. He turned his pain into purpose. The same man who once spent nights dodging bullets now spent mornings coaching his son's football team. The same artist who once rapped about violence now spoke about love, community, and growth. There was something almost poetic about it, how a man shaped by chaos could become a symbol of calm. Tupac's shadow will always follow him, but instead of mourning what was lost, Snoop started honoring what remained. Every stage he stepped on, every interview he gave, and every word he spoke about those days carried a tone, not of bitterness, but of reflection. The pain was still there, but now it had a purpose. He built a legacy that wasn't rooted in fear, but in endurance. The gangster became the icon. The survivor became the teacher. And in a world that once celebrated revenge, Snoop's greatest rebellion was choosing its worst enemy, peace. Because in the end, something had to die for something else to live. And against every odd, every bullet, and every betrayal, Snoop Dogg chose to live. And that choice, that quiet defiance, became the truest victory of them all. What do you think about Tupac's death? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Until next time.